Hello, Man in Gray here with another Man in Gray book review. Today's book is Walt Disney's Uncle Scrooge, The 24 Carat Moon by Carl Barks. This book was published by Fantagraphics in 2020 and it's 202 pages long. Carl Barks worked in the animation studio of Walt Disney from 1938 to 1942. He was a story man. He basically wrote plots and drew storyboards for Donald Duck cartoon shorts. But he became increasingly dissatisfied with his work there because Walt Disney basically he ran his studio by committee. No one person had any kind of artistic um, uh, final say in anything. Everything was done by group, everything was done by committee, and Barks found it increasingly oppressive. And so in 1942, he left the Disney studio and moved out to Arizona, where he began raising chickens for a living. And that would have been the end of the story, except in 1942, Disney signed a contract with Western Publishing, a comic book publishing company, to do a series of comic books based on Walt Disney characters, Goofy, Mickey Mouse, and Donald Duck, and so forth. And Carl Barks was hired to do comic book stories based on the Donald Duck character. And this turned out to be the ideal situation for Carl Barks because he still lived in Arizona. He would draw these comic books at home, and then he would mail them to Los Angeles, and then they would run a few months later. And he had complete artistic control. And so he stayed there doing this for 24 years before he retired, and he drew over 500 stories for Western Publishing based on Donald Duck. He also created a number of other characters that weren't in the original Disney cartoons, the most famous of which was Uncle Scrooge. But he also created um, uh, Grandma Duck, Gyro Gearloose, the inventor, Magica Dispel, the evil wizard, sorceress, and of course the Beagle Boys, the terrible Beagle Boys. Now, what Fantagraphics has done is they have published all, or they're in the process of publishing all of the Carl Barks comic books in chronological order in these very nice hardcover editions. They're full color, all the comics are in full color, and they're in chronological order. At the end of the book, there's a set of little essays on each story um, by a Disney scholar. And then there's also a biography of Carl Barks at the end of it as well. And there's a list of which comic books these stories originally appeared in and when. Um, Now, this particular book, I picked this one out of all the all the editions, the 24 Karat Moon. This one dates from 1959 to 1960, so late 50s, early 1960 is when these comic books were drawn. This is really when Carl Barks was at his peak, and the reason I picked it is it's typical of Barks at his peak, and it has some of my favorite stories that I remember when I was a kid. Now, if you're not familiar with the Uncle Scrooge character, he's the richest duck in all the world. And he's kind of a parody of, well, of course, he's based on Ebenezer Scrooge from A Christmas Carol, but he's a parody of out of control capitalism. He's incredibly greedy, keeps all of his money in a giant money bin, a big building full of coins and dollars. And no matter how much money he has, he always wants more. And the what makes this a fun series is that he often travels all over the world. So this gives Barks a chance to draw exotic locales. He goes all over the world trying to find money, gold mines or whatever. And he always drags his nephews, Donald and Huey, Dewey, and Louie, along with him for these adventures. Now, Scrooge is not a complete bad guy. He's actually not a villain. He's just greedy and selfish. Um, in some of these stories, he is cast as a villain, but he's not a total bad guy. He's honest. Even though he's a greedy capitalist, he's honest. He never cheats anybody. He's always ethical, and sometimes he actually turns down money uh, when for his conscience sake. And sometimes he realizes that what he's doing is going to damage the environment or hurt people, and so he changes his mind. But usually he goes for the bucks. Now, another reason I picked this volume is it's got one of my favorite stories in there, which is called The Prize of Pizarro, and it's pretty typical of these kind of Uncle Scrooge adventure stories. In The Prize of Pizarro, uh, Scrooge buys an old Spanish galleon that belonged to the conquistador Pizarro, and he turns it over to the Duckburg City Park. But before he turns it over, he and his nephews go through the ship and kind of inspect it. And it's there that Scrooge finds a letter that's tucked away in a little cribby, and it's from one of the sailors on board the ship, and it contains a map to the ancient Inca gold mines. Well, then, of course, Scrooge has to go find them. So he flies to Peru with his nephews, and they climb up these cliffs to the Andes Mountains in search of gold. Now, the gag, the conceit of this little story is that way up there in the mountains, miles away from civilization, their Inca soldiers are still there. They don't realize that the Inca Empire fell hundreds of years ago. They think the Inca Empire is still in power. They think the emperor is still around, and they're still guarding the gold mines. Now, before they reach the valley where these soldiers are, Uncle Scrooge and his nephews find some ancient Spanish armor. So they put that on, and when they enter the valley, the guards see them and assume that they're Spaniards come to loot the mines again. So they set off a series of booby traps. But the booby traps are all designed for humans, and these ducks are only about 2 feet tall, and so they always fail. Now, one of the booby traps is a giant stone ball that rolls down a causeway. But because the ducks are so short, the giant stone ball just goes over their heads and misses them. Now, if you've ever seen the first Indiana Jones movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark, you'll know there's an iconic opening scene where Indiana Jones is being chased by a giant stone ball that rolls down a causeway. It may just be a coincidence, or it may be that George Lucas read this comic book at some point and decided to incorporate that scene into the movie because it looks exactly like the scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And there's some other booby traps too. And the big gag is the ducks never realize that there's Inca soldiers out there. They think these booby traps have been set off automatically from hundreds of years before. And there's a twist at the end of the story. And there often is in Carl Barks' stories. There's a kind of ironic twist at the end. Barks lived in Arizona, and then later he moved to Oregon, and so he had a deep appreciation of the environment. He was an early environmentalist, and he often uses these stories to kind of subtly push an environmental message. And of course, one of the worst things you can do to the environment is mine. Mining is terrible for the environment, and he brings that message out kind of subtly at the end of this. So anyway, that's one of the many stories in here, and they're not all Uncle Scrooge. There's also some stories about Grandma Duck and Gyro Gearloose, the inventor, and the Junior Woodchucks. That was another invention of his, is a kind of parody of the Boy Scouts, the Junior Woodchucks, which Huey, Dewey, and Louie belong to. So anyway, if you read these stories as a kid, you're going to love going back through here. There's a lot of nostalgia here. They're beautifully printed in full color. Nice high quality paper, sewn bindings. This is a book that's going to last for a while. And if you've never read any of Carl Barks's cartoons, you can pick any of these really and appreciate them. The amazing thing to me about Barks is he was a self-taught artist. He never had a single day of art school training. And yet he was one of the great comic book artists from the golden age of comic books. Some of these historical fantasy stories have these huge full-page spreads of just elaborate pictures of mountains and clouds and waves and trees and all. It's really impressively drawn, and they're very cleverly told. And some of the stories are 16 pages, and some are only 6 or 8 pages, and there's some that are just 1 page. But he always manages to tell a story in a very concise way and keep it interesting. So I highly recommend any one of the books in this series, but particularly this one, The 24 Karat Moon. The book is Walt Disney's Uncle Scrooge, The 24 Karat Moon. The author is Carl Barks, and this has been another Man in Gray book review.